Counterterrorism Today. Up-to-date analysis with Dan Diker.
This is Dan Diker, IDC International Radio. You're listening to Counterterrorism Today. We're going to be talking about ISIS on the march from Syria to Sinai. Is ISIS becoming a regional and international strategic threat, or is it really an intransigent insurgency limited to Syria and Iraq and now Sinai? Well, we have an extraordinary panel of experts today. Sitting opposite me is Ambassador Dr. Dimitar Mihaylov, who is really a great Arabist here in the Middle East, having spent 7 years in Syria and a great expert of Islam in the Near East. And with us on the line is perhaps Israel's greatest Arab affairs and Islamic affairs commentator, Ehud Yaari, who we will be turning to in just a moment for his commentary and analysis on the growing ISIS threat on Israel's borders. Dr. Ambassador Mihaylov, it's a pleasure having you with us today on Counterterrorism Today. Give us your sense about ISIS. What is so popular about ISIS, and how do we assess its rather rapid spread throughout the Middle East?
Thank you very much, Dan. I would prefer call me Dimitar because we are in academia.
You have a deal.
Leave aside the titles. I'm very happy to be with IDC International Radio. It's $1 million question. You cannot answer on that question just in few sentences. But the right approach to that question is, what is attracting as a magnet of so many disenchanted young Muslims to join ranks with Islamic State? What is the soft power of Islamic State? And the answer is that it is breaking all the barriers, and it is breaking the ideological barriers of all this Islamic edifice that has been erected throughout 14th century. And on the other hand, behavioristically, you can do almost everything. I mean, you have no boundaries, no barriers in front of you. So it's empowering of powerless, and it's like drug, like opium. So in few sentences, I will say that.
There we go. You know, that's an important point of departure. It's an opiate that is empowering the powerless around the world, not only in the Middle East. I want to turn to Ehud Yaari, who deals with soft power and hard power. Mr. Yaari, welcome to Counterterrorism Today. Thank you for joining us, sir. Question for you, as someone who follows this from minute to minute and has for the last 41 years. What is ISIS's hard power threat to Israel from the Sinai today, in your assessment, sir?
Well, I think that the Islamic State in the Sinai, what they call the Islamic State province of the Sinai, formerly the Ansar Bait al-Maqdis, the ABM organization, is primarily occupied now with fighting the Egyptian army, which has deployed over one mechanized division into the peninsula with Israeli consent. So their main priority now is Sinai. They have carried out several attacks against Israel. They are threatening to try and do more. But at the moment, they are under great pressure, not thoroughly effective by the Egyptian army, especially the Air Force. And it's not a priority. Generally speaking, Israel is not a priority for the Islamic State at the moment. It's going to change if the Islamic State is going to keep expanding, etc. But the trend that we are witnessing over the past year is that the Islamic State is, in my opinion, being weakened. The territory is shrinking. And I think that during 2016, we will see most probably an attempt to wrest control over the cities of Raqqa in Syria and Mosul in Iraq from ISIS. And then we will have a very different organization to deal with. No longer a state or quasi-state with territorial integrity, but another type of an underground Islamist jihadist terrorist organization which is operating in the shadows. Their chances of expanding seem to me very slim.
This seems to be an optimistic assessment from your point of view, Mr. Yaari. Where does your sense of that the dimensions of the ISIS threat will be reduced, will contract from its strategic dimensions today to a much more tactical, as you call it, the dark shadows tactical dimension?
Well, I think that the Islamic State, and this is a good part of the debate going amongst jihadists these days, many people, Al-Qaeda supporters and others, are blaming the Islamic State for trying to swallow too much, to go too far, declaring the caliphate, etc., in a situation where they have so many enemies deployed against them. So put yourself in the shoes of the Islamic State governor in Raqqa or Mosul. He has to take into account such as enemies as the Kurds, both in Iraq and Syria. He has to take into account the Iraqi security forces, the pro-Iranian militias which were mobilized in Iraq, over 100,000 strong. He has to face the coalition air force, mainly the Americans, not really effective so far, but still there and bombing. He has to take into account the Russian air force with over 100 planes, which can switch easily from attacking other rebel groups to attacking ISIS. There is a whole bunch of Syrian rebel groups who are determined to fight ISIS, etc., etc. They've very simply managed to line up against them too many enemies for them to be able to cope with.
This is yes, go ahead, Mr. Yaari.
And I think that we have already seen the territory controlled or semi-controlled by the Islamic State shrinking by, let's say, 20-30% at least. I think the capture of Raqqa, which is the capital on the upper Euphrates in Syria, I see it as a very plausible military option. And even Mosul, a city of 2 million people and more, can be dealt with if there is a combined effort by all the parties that I've mentioned before. So what I see is a process in which the Islamic State will lose territory and will keep shrinking rather than a situation in which it keeps expanding.
So, Dimitar, this is really a fascinating assessment here, which I think is rare. We haven't heard this type of assessment, Ehud Yaari, saying we're looking at ISIS overreach and a resultant contraction of ISIS's threat in terms of territory, as opposed to what is commonly understood, which is this constant expansion into Afghanistan and onto the borders of Israel, and even in the borders of Israel, not as a strategic threat, of course, but flags here and flags there. What is your sense, Dimitar, of Ehud Yaari's assessment here? Is ISIS, is it overreach and expand and contraction, or do you see how do you see it?
Thank you. It's a fascinating question, and of course, when we think about that. Certainly we have to apply the doctrine of limits of power. That has been governing the military affairs since ages. My sense is that indeed ISIS is losing ground, no doubt about that. But I'm not so optimistically feeling that operatively they will lose Raqqa, they will lose Mosul. I would share the opinion that even if they being defeated partially or militarily, they won't disappear. They will be here. I agree with the assessment that they will go to the shadows and they will continue to, even they may be more dangerous because they may switch side and penetrate into Europe, penetrate to other areas. Now they are concentrated in a geographical area and they have a certain modus operandi, but if they're destroyed and they go basically global or they may turn more dangerous. But let me comment on something very important. Clearly, we see two approaches in the jihadi Salafi Takfiri circles. One is the evolutionary approach of Osama bin Laden, that the construction of caliphate should go through evolution, because in 88, 89, he gave his bayat, pledge of allegiance to Mullah Omar. So the idea was that from Afghanistan, and take into account that Afghanistan by that time was not caliphate, it was emirate, it could grow gradually to something like caliphate. And on the other hand, we have this jumping from the head approach of Abu Bakr Baghdadi, creating out of the blue an Islamic caliphate and imposing that against all the norms and all the law, jurisprudential law of Islam, because there are certain regulations how a caliph should be chosen and how could this construction be achieved. So basically we have two approaches, and the approach of the Islamic State will be losing ground. But to what extent, and will it be defeated and shrinking, I'm not quite sure.
Mr. Yaari, as I hear Dimitar offer his commentary on the uncertainty of the shrinkage that you've expressed some confidence in, let's take a look, for example, there are those that report that if, in fact, there is shrinkage and contraction, Mr. Yaari, as you have asserted, at that point, al-Baghdadi will instruct his forces to turn against Israel, because that becomes sort of the emergency chord for ISIS at a time of, let's say, at a time of strategic emergency. Is your sense that that is possible, that that's the moment at which they'll turn against Israel? And B, I've heard reports that ISIS is actually afraid of Israel and have talked about Israel as the one really prominent enemy that they'd have trouble assaulting.
Look, Dan, the whole idea of ISIS, contrary to the traditional Al-Qaeda approach, was that we have to create a territorial base and we have to deal with the near enemy, which is the Arab regimes. Contrary to Osama bin Laden's concept of let's go for the far enemy, yes, Twin Towers, New York, etc., in order to weaken American support of the Arab regimes and go on from there. And there is a debate amongst jihadist circles about that, and I think what we see, what we read in Arabic, of course, is more and more criticism of the approach chosen by the Islamic State, because it's not working, and my opinion, it's not going to work. Now, we have seen already over the past year that the Islamic State is driven to adopt more and more Al-Qaeda type tactics, such as the attacks in Paris, Europe, and elsewhere. That was not their agenda in the beginning. Now, they have an option to try and convince their affiliates in southern Syria, which is the Yarmouk River Martyrs Brigade, or in the Sinai, province of ISIS, to devote more attention to attacks on Israel. This is not happening because of the situation on the ground. Those guys in the Sinai are engaged in a very fierce battle, continuous, with the Egyptian army, and the guys in the southern Golan have to cope with a whole array of other rebel organizations that are set against them, and they have nothing to win by trying to provoke Israel. So it's not happening. Now, ISIS is trying to penetrate Israel proper and the Palestinian arena, and we see that they are managing to garner support, and there is quite a sentiment of support to ISIS amongst Palestinians. But this is not an organized effort, and I doubt that in the foreseeable future it can take the form of some organized terrorist activity.
Well, nonetheless, it's psychologically there's a threat assessment there in Mr. Yaari's comments on Israel's borders and in Israel that we're going to have to keep a close eye on. Mr. Yaari, we promised you after 10 minutes we'd let you go to all kinds of other obligations that you have, only if you promise to come back to Counterterrorism Today. We thank you so much for your assessment, and we'll look forward to hearing more from you.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Excuse me. You know, Dimitar, it's interesting when you think of the psychological aspect of ISIS. You talk about soft power. It seems that the psychological soft power threat assessment is as great or even greater, arguably, than its hard power achievements on the ground.
Yes, definitely. But given the recent comments, really there are many considerations that we have to take into account. It's very difficult to say that this is the soft power that is most important. Of course, the far enemy, which is the West, and the near enemy have been mentioned, but I would add also to that the nearest enemy. The nearest enemy is all these militias, even some of them with Salafi jihadi leaning, that ISIS engaged it. So if I'm permitted to use the concept of Thomas Hobbes centuries ago, this is war of all against war.
Wait, would you say that again? This is?
War of all against all. So ISIS are inconveniently situated in but this was the situation in the Middle East since centuries. So they have to take into account different levels of enemies. But to the point, is Israel possible target of ISIS? We have to compare between two factors. One is the resources consequences, because of course they fear that if they go against Israel, consequences will be heavy. But on the other hand, you have the issue of legitimacy. The more they prove that they could scratch the tiger, so to say, the more they could gain legitimacy. And recently we have been witnessing two messages during the last half year against Israel, even one in Hebrew. So I wouldn't put...
Those are ISIS messages that we've seen on YouTube. We've seen them on YouTube.
Yes, on YouTube. I wouldn't put that on a black burner. It should be taken into consideration, but not viewed and analyzed as immediate threat. I agree with the opinion that you have a cost assessment of any action according to the ISIS. And I agree that many of the radical Salafi jihadi thinkers like Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi, they distance from ISIS because obviously this tactic is not gaining much of ground. But it's a very complicated situation, and I wouldn't be clear-cut what will happen and how it will happen.
You know, there is a great debate, Dimitar, in the West as to whether ISIS is mainstream Islam or whether ISIS is a severe perversion of Islam. Now, you served and lived in Damascus for some time, for some years, and you heard the debate in the beginning of what was known as the Arab Spring, which today we call the Islamic revolutions, perhaps. What is your sense as a classical Islamist, a trained Islamic scholar, whether this ISIS sort of, in inverted commas, nuclear attack on the ground throughout the Middle East, metaphorically speaking, comes out of classical Islam, or is it a perversion of Islam?
It's a clear-cut, to that question there is a clear-cut answer. Of course, it's a devotion from classical Islam. Of course, you have three main pillars of ISIS. This is jihad, takfir, and pervert interpretation of Sharia. But basically, it's neo-Wahhabi and neo-Salafi trend, and it's so far away from the classical Islam that we shouldn't even discuss that. The real question would be whether we should compare Al-Qaeda, the classical Al-Qaeda, with the classical Salafi jihadi approach with ISIS, and we could come to conclusion that at certain moment Al-Qaeda will look like moderate if compared to ISIS, basically the behavior of Nusra Front. So there is no doubt that ISIS is far away from the normative classical postulates of Islam. It has nothing to do with that, and several concepts as using jihad as individual obligation, several Salafi extreme concepts, they are applied in a very extreme and pervert way. So from academic point of view, there is no doubt that this is a deviation, even mutation of what is known as classical Islam.
Dimitar, I want to bring into this conversation a great scholar of counterterrorism as well as the Middle East. That's Nadav Pollak of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He is the Gil and Diane Glazer Fellow there at the Washington Institute. He's done a lot of work here in the counterterrorism field, advising countries in the region, including Israel, on counterterrorism issues. Welcome, Nadav, from Washington. I hope you've got a cup of coffee. It's only 9:45 over there, and I hope that you're wide awake and ready to jump in here. We have a really I would call it an intense panel. Focusing on ISIS from Syria to Sinai, and we have been, what we're discussing here is whether we are looking at a expected contraction of ISIS as we move forward because of overreach, or is ISIS just beginning to spread its wings and march with its bloody boots across the Middle East, as we've seen into Sinai, downing Russian plane, into Afghanistan, on the borders of Israel, and of course establishing a pseudo-state in the lands of Syria and Iraq. What's your sense?
Of course. First of all, Dan, thank you for having me. I would say that we need to, when we look about ISIS in the region, we need to sort of differentiate between different countries and different areas that ISIS is in right now. First of all, I agree with the previous assessment that Mr. Yaari gave you about the contraction of ISIS in Iraq and Syria. We've been seeing ISIS losing territory in Ramadi. We've been seeing ISIS losing territory in northwest Syria, and we do see them losing in some key point battles. But I would say that as the war in Syria and Iraq ebbs and flows, we need to remember that the dynamics can change. So, for example, every time we see ISIS losing in one territory, we see them explode in another territory. So just for example, yesterday we saw ISIS taking different posts from Shabbat to Nusra on the border with Lebanon. On the other front, we see ISIS in South Syria in a governor named Lajat, which is a little bit of north of Daraa, in the area of South Syria. So I would agree with the assessment that we see a contraction of their territory in Syria and Iraq, but we need to still be vigilant. You can see right now more American forces actually entering the battlefield. 2 weeks ago, there was a report that the U.S. is sending the 101st Airborne to join some key battles, it's a good development. Now we need to see more contribution from countries in the region. But when I talk about the region as a whole, you need to remember that, for example, in Libya, we see the ISIS branch, they're actually gaining more and more power. We see in Sinai, the Sinai branch is also sort of being able to act freely. And we see different, but not very significant, but different attacks in Yemen. So I would say that, yes, it's true that ISIS, its territory in Syria and Iraq is contracting, but we need to look at ISIS as a phenomenon as a whole, and not specifically on specific places in Syria and Iraq.
Well, I think that's a key point, Nadav, is to look at ISIS as a whole. And I asked Dimitar before you joined us by phone from Washington as to whether the soft power weaponry of ISIS, meaning its psychological effect, its social network abilities, its media capabilities, when you look at it with regard to Israel, Israel has now, since August of 2015 until the present day, has suffered a spate of what they call the knifing intifada. I would argue it is not at all an intifada. It is basically just knife terrorism, widely inspired, many believe, and I among them, by ISIS and ISIS's Salafi jihadi, and as Dimitar put it, unusual Salafi jihadi approach. What's your sense of ISIS's soft power weaponry?
So regarding the Israeli case, I would agree that some of the attacks are probably ISIS-inspired. We had the incident in Beersheba, we had the incident of Nashat Mulham, which was an ISIS-inspired terrorist. But I don't want to sort of make this phenomenon of ISIS inspired in Israel across the board. I do think that most of the attacks that we've seen since August are not ISIS-related. They are more, we see some of them are related to Hamas, some of them are related to different other Palestinian factions, and some of them are disgruntled youth that are, in East Jerusalem and in the West Bank that are very violent. They don't see the future. They decide one day to take a knife. We can see it as a result of a lot of incitement and also a lot of the fact that they don't see a future in the future Palestine. When you talk about it as a whole, about ISIS soft power, I do think, first of all, their media work is remarkable. When you look at it as an observant you see the videos that they put out there, you see the different messaging. They're doing a great job of just showing their victories, showing how for the jihadist community, they show we are the one who are victorious right now. You should come and fight with us. But we also need to remember that a lot of the foreign fighters are going to ISIS. Yes, it's true the media has its power over them, but a lot of them are people that new converts. They want the sense of the community. They want the sense of a mission. And some of them are just deranged people that, they see it's like a computer game. They go, they take a weapon and start fighting everyone. So I do think that soft power is important, but I wouldn't say that this is like the major effect right now that ISIS is gaining from having so many foreign fighters. I would say that it's their perceived narrative of victory. You see the lack of governance in so many countries that are making vacuums of power and instability that people are just trying to latch onto something. And I would say they have the resources. They have a lot of money. They have a lot of weapons. They have a lot of people to show that they are the one who are victory right now. And the jihadist community is consolidating in their part.
I want to turn to Dimitar here in the studio. What's your sense of Nadav Pollak's assessment here on images of victory, images of heroism? There is a difference, it seems, between disaffected European youth and the hundreds or several hundred Americans who have fled to the areas of jihad, primarily to Iraq and Syria. Let's talk about the differences, assuming there are, between American and European youth. What do you think? What's happening on the European side that's driving thousands of youth to Syria? Some of them, by the way, via Turkey, your neighbor, and back to Europe. What's happening on the European side?
Definitely, I agree with Nadav that this is a phenomenon that could not be measured with metrics, that could not be measured in cause and effect, but rather as a phenomenon with deep psychological roots. I can barely comment on the American side. I could say how I view the things in Europe. In Europe, still you have a great level of tension, and still many of these disaffected and disenchanted youths that suffer sociologically in their own environment, may be attracted by this powerful image of breaking all barriers and using victorious tool of power, how to empower them and how to make them feel that they could do anything and they could win. But on the other hand, you should take into account that there are more than 3,000 Tunisians there, and I've been on several occasions. I've been to Tunisia. It's an excellent country. I can barely imagine how, and this is by far and large the highest number, why from Middle East also countries like Tunisia, so many youths are attracted by this soft power. So it's a complex phenomena. We should approach it with viewing from different aspects, and we shouldn't be clear-cut giving one aspect or the other in it.
But I mean, give us a bottom line on when you see French youth, British youth, Belgian youth, dressed up in the ISIS haberdashery, in costumes, beheading people. one looks at this and said, "Gosh, on the one hand, these are Western people. On the other hand, these are the most severely radicalized Islamists."
This is precisely what is important to be known. These are not Western people. These are people who has been implanted in the West, but they lived in different subculture, different environment. You have so many examples. Sayed Qutb, who's been in the 50s to the States. You have Mohammed Atta, the Hamburg cell. So from psychological point of view, all these people, they physically lived in the West, but psychologically they've been living in different dimension. So to conclude that these are Westerners that somehow, of course you have converts, Western, but these are rather on psychological level. But this is a sociological phenomenon. People who lived on the margins, who's been living in a different subculture, and not in harmony with the Western society. And this is the biggest illusion in a multicultural Europe, that the soft power of Europe could attract them and put them into the European melting pot.
Well, you know, Nadav, this is really quite a transition over to you. Here, Dimitar talked about jihadists living in Western cultures. He didn't refer to Europe, which was the premise of the question, but he went right to Said Qutb, who some know, many know, some don't know, actually lived in the United States in the 1950s and became even more radicalized living in the United States, counter to what many claim is that if you pull people out of the Middle East, you put them in the United States, people become more moderate. What is your sense as an observer and an analyst of these things? Is the threat of young radicalized Americans going to the areas of jihad? Is it as serious a threat as we see happening in Europe?
Yeah. So that's a very interesting question. First of all, I would say I think it's a smaller threat than Europe just because of the logistics of going from the U.S. To Syria and Iraq and to other places. It's harder, and the U.S. has a better sense of who left, who tried to come back, and that kind of incident. Just to give you some numbers, so since 2014, around 71 individuals have been charged with ISIS-related activities in the U.S. 56 of them have been arrested in 2015. And as we talked about, disgruntled youth, actually the average age of the people that got arrested is 26. 86% of them were male. So you actually see that we're talking about people in an age that they're trying to find their framework. They're trying to sort of find a purpose. And some of them, a lot of them are new converts or second generation of Muslim immigrants. They don't find this sense of community in their communities in the U.S. or in other places, also in Europe. And they feel, suddenly they see this, what is happening in Syria and Iraq. They buy this narrative of a war against Islam. They find this narrative of everyone right now is against the Syrian people and against the Iraqi people. And they sort of say, well, you know what? I'm in an age that I can fight. I'm looking for a purpose right now. Maybe this is it. And they see ISIS is being very smart of putting videos out there of foreign fighters saying, like, you know what? I was looking for a purpose in life. I came to Syria. I found it. And now I have a sense of a friendship, a sense of a community. I found a wife. I can have a beautiful family life here. And there are people that are buying into this narrative. I don't want to exaggerate in saying this is a broad phenomenon, but since 9/11, in the last 2 years, we see more and more incidents of ISIS-inspired cases, people that are trying to leave the country in order to join ISIS. So it's still not, it's not I would say a strategic threat, but it's something that we should look into, and it's something that we should monitor. And right now, the authorities in the U.S. are doing a very good job in stopping that incident.
Nadav, I want to ask you this final question before we thank you for your contribution here. We have seen in the United States a number of terrorist incidents in the last months in San Bernardino and in Michigan and in other places. That more and more we understand these folks have been radicalized, naturalized Americans, radicalized by ISIS, and undertaking horrendous assaults. In the 9/11 assault, you had essentially Islam is coming. You had Arab Islam is coming from the Middle East, being installed in the United States, training there, and then carrying out a U.S. The 9/11, as we saw in at Twin Towers and the Pentagon. But are we seeing now, with 2.5 to 3 million Muslims living in the United States, a real possibility of a type of mass radicalization? I mean, it could turn in, without being hysterical about it. I mean, are we looking at a possibility of a massive number or a massive increase in serious ISIS-inspired terrorism in the United States because of the radicalization component, as opposed to terrorists coming from Osama bin Laden's having been mobilized from Afghanistan and other places of jihad into the far enemy, into the United States?
Well, I don't think so. I think that in general, I think that actually the Muslim community in the U.S. is doing their part in trying to find that radicalization processes. I know some Muslims from the community in Washington, D.C. that are actually doing great work in talking to youth and sort of explaining to them why this is wrong, sort of explaining to them why is this not the justified narrative of Islam. And other communities in the U.S. are doing a great job in fighting this phenomenon. We need to remember that, with all this ISIS-inspired attacks, yes, it's a lot of people are concerned, but we don't see it. It's not, as I told you, like in the last 2 years, we've seen 71 individuals that have been charged with ISIS-related activities. It's not a number that we can perceive. We can fight it. We can find other ways sort of to cope with it. I don't think it's something that dangers. I'm not an American, so I don't want to talk as an American, but for me, it's not something that dangers American society. And I think that the American society are getting much more from the Muslim community that helps them fight this phenomena. And I do think that the U.S. should not let one incident or two incidents to sort of right now to paint in one brush the American Muslim community, because I do think the American Muslim community, a lot of them are doing their part in fighting this phenomena. Just a final note,
please,
that doesn't relate to this question. I do think that we should focus on ISIS. We should fight them. We should do more than we're doing right now in the Middle East. But we also shouldn't forget the threat by Al-Qaeda. Right now, it's in the media. Most countries are focusing on ISIS. But we have the reemergence of some branches of Al-Qaeda in the region that we should monitor better, and we should right now plan for the future threat. Because right now we have in Syria Jabhat al-Nusra, which I will argue that it's actually a bigger threat than ISIS in Syria. We have AQAP in Yemen that it's gaining more and more power right now because of the instability in the country. We have in Afghanistan and in other places, you have the reemergence of some elements of Al-Qaeda, which are going to stay with us even after ISIS will be gone, because right now we're focusing only about ISIS.
Well,
so I think we should... Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
No, so I just think that, yes, ISIS is important. We should fight it. We should do all in our power in order to stem this phenomena and do whatever we can in order to stop it. But we also should turn and gaze in the future threat that is Al-Qaeda right now in Syria, Yemen, and in other places as well.
There it is, the big challenge to the West, fighting on multiple fronts against terrorists. It's been a major problem for the West because they always go to what they perceive as the most extreme. So I'm going to turn to Dimitar for the last for this sense of Al-Qaeda ISIS competition. Nadav is saying, let's not take our eye off the Al-Qaeda ball. What's your sense about that, Dimitar? Are we looking? Are we over focusing on ISIS? We really need to balance our counterterrorism interests and keep fighting on multiple fronts.
Absolutely, and I'll go further. It's not only on the radical jihadi Salafi scale, but rather we should view what is happening in the Middle East now as a splint, as a great clash between Sunni and Shia Islam that hasn't happened since 13th century, since when Saladin defeated the Fatimid Caliphate. So we have a clear-cut confrontation between the Sunni and the Shia camps, and in a unique diary that trend is producing radicalization. We should be viewing also on the Shia front. Go ahead and view the militias that are fighting in Syria, the Shia militias coming from Iraq, even Fatimiyun from Afghanistan. So the concept of jihad in classical Jafari Shia jurisprudence is not present. So they developed new tools and new ideological trends to encourage radicalization through a military form. So viewed through this lens, we should be viewing the whole area as in a trend of radicalization. But let me finish with two very short expressions. On the other hand, we shouldn't view the current trend of radicalization or ISIS, I agree that we are too much focused on ISIS, as something unique, something that sprung right now in 20th century. If you go down deep into Islamic culture, you'll see that, for instance, the Kharijite movement, the third movement, the splinter group from the Shia, they invented many concepts that you see them now in ISIS. For instance, the necessity of second hijrah, the necessity of second immigration, or the concept of the rescued group, al-Firqa najiyah, because there is a hadith saying of Prophet that there will be 73 groups and only one will be the rescued, the saved group that will go to hell. The rest of the Muslim groups, they'll go to hell. So if you dig deep into the layers of Islamic history, you'll see these trends of radicalization reinvigorated now by ISIS in a modern context.
Well, that is quite a warning to us all. I want to thank you very much, Ambassador Dr. Dimitar Mihaylov, for all of your insights here. I think we've covered hard power and soft power of ISIS's march across the Middle East, but always remembering, I think, as Nadav Pollak has reminded us, keep your eye on multiple balls. You have to juggle multiple radical Islamic balls, if you were, pardon the metaphor, but keep them all in the air. This is a big challenge to the West. The other challenge to the West, I might say, is there is no good guy versus bad guy within the burning cauldrons of Islam. These Shia and Sunni, ISIS and Al-Qaeda on the Sunni side, and the Iranian groups, the Iranian regime-sponsored groups, can all switch sides and fight with one another according to the moment and according to convenience. Any last thought on that, Nadav, before we end our program?
No, I completely agree that we should always look on the multiple fronts that we have. And, as Israel, there is still the ongoing debate of what is the bigger threat to Israel today in the northern side. You saw Minister of Defense Bogi Ya'alon last week saying that we are more concerned of the Iranian front on our border than ISIS. You have other people from inside the IDF and other security establishments saying that, no, we are more concerned about ISIS. But yeah, that's exactly the debate that is ongoing right now inside the country, and we should keep on our eyes on all the fronts. Exactly.
Keeping our eyes on the fronts. Nadav Pollak, the Gil and Diane Glazer Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Thank you very much for your counterterrorism assessment, your assessment of Islam in the Near East. We'll look forward to having you back on Counterterrorism Today very soon.
Thank you for having me, Dan.
Thank you. And to you, Dimitar, last word. What's your bottom line sense we want to leave with our special listeners for this special roundtable on ISIS?
Thank you, Dan. Again, I'm very happy being with you in studio. So finally, we shouldn't be obsessed. We shouldn't be petrified by the current trends. But rather, it's a good conclusion that we should keep the multiple varieties of this trend. We shouldn't look at each phenomena as sui generis, but rather we should view the area as trends. And these trends, they are related with history, they are related with culture, they are related with socio-political behavior. So it's a complex phenomena, and simply we have to be tuned on.
Yeah, we have to be tuned in and focused focusing on multiple fronts in order to counterattack jihad and Salafi jihadisti Islam. Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Dr. Dimitar Mihaylov, for your insights, a great observer and scholar in the Middle East. And thank you, our dear listeners, for joining us today on Counterterrorism Today here at IDC International Radio.
Counterterrorism Today. Up-to-date analysis with Dan Diker.